This is an article that came out in the Pew Research Center. Now, recently there was the G7, and these are the most powerful nations on the planet, financially and economically. Well, another thing the G7 all have in common, every single one of those nations have low birth rates. So low fertility rates and aging populations have become worldwide concerns, but the G7 nations, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States have stood out for their low birth rates and graying of their citizens since the mid 20th century, when the United Nations first recorded this data. The biggest gap occurred during 1970 and 1975 when the group of leading industrial nations was established. At that point, the global fertility rate was 4.47 projected lifetime births per woman, but 2.03 among G7 nations. The gap between global fertility rates and those of the G7 nations has closed dramatically. Since then, the UN projects that the gap between global and G7 fertility will continue to narrow. France will preside over, and they already have, they presided over the G7 summit this year. And, they met on a whole host of different agendas. But one thing they all have in common, no matter how powerful they claim they are and how much they have economically, they all suffer from low birth rate. Japan has an especially long history of low fertility, having experienced below replacement fertility for decades. In 2018, the Japanese government reported the lowest number of babies born since 1899. When this data was first collected, Italy recorded its lowest total number of babies born in 2018, and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention says the US hit with the lowest number of births in 32 years after a continuous decline over many years. See, this has been going on a lot longer than when they just first came out and said something. Now, in the US, this has been going on since the 50s, but they don't talk very much about it. They try to make it seem like it's something that recently started happening. This has long started happening. It goes back many decades. And as you can see, from the 1950s on, you can see the decline is increasing in every single nation that was part of the G7. In addition to an overall decline in fertility rates throughout the 21st century, the UN projects an aging global population. While the UN projects that the global median age will be 41.9 in 2100, G7 nations are projected to have a higher median age, which is 48.5 than the global median. Japan and Italy especially stand out for their older population. By 2025, the median age in Japan is projected to be slightly over 50 years old, while Italy is projected to hit that mark 5 years later in 2030. The US and Canada are projected to have the youngest median age of all the G7 nations by 2100 at 45.5 and 46.8, respectively. Largely due to migration to these nations from the rest of the world. Despite the migration, both the US and Canada will still have older populations than the global median. Some experts say aging populations present challenges for national economies and governments, while others argue an aging population isn't as problematic as we would expect. The older demographic can create a labor shortages. No, it already has. It already has created labor shortages. And not only that, there are a lot of people that should have retired and they are working beyond their retired years because they can't find replacements like they used to. As in the case in Japan, or burden a nation's pension system, a dilemma which Italy is facing. So, ladies and gentlemen, you have a lack of births and you have a booming aging population. And this is one thing that's consistent in all of the G7 nations. And as time rolls by, this actually is getting worse, especially in the quote unquote developed nations. Okay, these nations are all claiming they are developed and they are all suffering from the same thing. These are the nations that claim they are the most advanced on the planet, and they are struggling to have babies. You know, this is why, they keep jumping from one reason to the next, but the one reason they won't touch on is genetics. They won't touch on that. But they'll tell you, oh, well, the generation don't want to have kids. Well, this generation, they're into their careers. Oh, it's the plastic that's causing low sperm. But, you're not just having those problems. Those, yeah, may very well be problems, but there is also something genetically going on with all of these nations that, like I said, they are trying their best to avoid admitting. And they're not going to admit this, y'all. When you got too much ego and you are so arrogant, you're not going to admit these things. You want people to believe you're a lot stronger than what you really are. And the lack of babies is really looking like a weakness in all of these nations. And this is a global phenomena. So you can't even say, okay, well, it's happening in this part of the world, but not this part of the world. I mean, really, the only continent that's booming with babies is Africa. The rest of these nations, they are literally falling apart. And all their world leaders and prime ministers and presidents, all they can do is just get up and tell the population to have babies. And they've been doing that now for decades, and those babies are not coming. They're not coming, you know? And one thing that Europe and America have in common, they have horrible, um, family leave on these jobs. They always have, you know. And like I said, you can tell the people that came up with these policies were not very much into their own families. They weren't. They had working in mind and not the family. And remember, it was these very nations that talked about putting careers first and focus on your job and all this stuff, right? And now this younger generation is doing exactly that. And now they're complaining that they're not getting married, they're not having babies, but they're doing exactly what you told them to do: focus on a career. Guess you just can't have the best of both worlds. So, ladies and gentlemen, please tell me what you think. Please leave your comment and subscribe. Don't forget to hit on the notification bell, and I'll see you on the next video. Peace, family.